so fast. Yeah, can we start? Can we start?
Yes. One second.
Yeah.
You can start now.
Okay. Hello, my name is Rishikesh and I am Community Manager at HoncHous Private Limited. HoncHous Private Limited is a technology company on a mission to equip students with the relevant skills and practice exposure through internship and online training. So today we have organized a session on web development by Harshvardhan Mishra. So let's get started. I would request Harshvardhan to get started with the session.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible.
Okay, and my screen is visible?
Yeah, screen is also visible.
Okay, cool. So I shall get started. So, good evening, everyone. I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to everyone who is part of this session and ready to get started with the web development. Web development, the general masses realized the importance of internet only when it was made accessible through a graphical user interface. So it was the introduction of the web browser in the early 1990s that led to the widespread popularity of the World Wide Web. So internet has been in existence for many years, but it was not into mainstream until recently. And the internet and the World Wide Web has changed the world forever. So the history of web development is marked by the creation of several technological solutions and multiple events. Many tools have been developed today, which is being used currently to develop websites and web application. And some of these might be quite familiar to you. And this include HTML5, CSS, JavaScript, since they continue to play an important role in web application development. Whether say Angular or React, they play a very important role in this domain to contribute to the existing ones, and they aren't meant to negate the pre-existing tools and technologies. So designing and developing websites is not a complicated task anymore, thanks to all these platforms available. In this session, we will be introducing you to the web development and how you can get started being a web developer and specifically a front-end developer, and what are all the tools and technologies that you need to explore before you get started with web development. As a developer and a programmer, this session is a pure theoretical start for you to get started with web development and web programming so that you can create new applications and new websites using these technologies. So let's get started. A gentle introduction to myself. My name is Harsh, and I am a web instructor at HoncHous. Beside being a web instructor at HoncHous, I am currently working as a software engineer intern at QXF2, and I am a Microsoft Learn Student Ambassador. I hold a firm belief that knowledge should be imparted so that it can help you to create some new projects and some new products that can be used to make your lives easier. And this is why I have a firm belief in web technologies, and I regularly work with them along with some other fields like cloud computing and artificial intelligence. My social handles either on GitHub or on Twitter or even on LinkedIn, and we can have a good conversation about web technologies and the recent trends of technologies that are rising away. So let's get started with the very basic introduction to internet and what internet actually is. So the reason why we are covering up some of the most basic one is because we want to cover up some of the basic terminologies that you actually need to understand before you get started with web development. So let's get started with internet. So internet is generally defined as a global network that is connecting millions and millions of computers all around the world. So unlike online services, which are like centrally controlled, for example, Flipkart or Netflix or Amazon, internet is completely decentralized. The basic meaning about being decentralized is that internet is not controlled by anyone. So there is no central authority that is controlling internet, and there is no single person who is controlling all the traffic on the internet. So it is completely decentralized. Anyone can make use of the internet and anyone can put their own services on it. So the term internet is actually the short term for international network or interconnected network, which is a system of interconnected networks using standardized communication protocols like TCP/IP, which stands for Transfer Control Protocol, and Internet Protocol. So with internet came the World Wide Web, and the World Wide Web, popularly called as WWW, is an information system made up of resources and users on the internet using protocols like HTTP. So WWW was invented by Tim Berners-Lee in the year 1989, who wrote the first web browser in 1990 while at CERN. So the web is one of the primary medium used by the people to interact on the internet. And some of the media on the web makes use of web pages that are created using HTML, which stands for Hypertext Markup Language. On the web, you literally need to use a resource address, which is either an IP address or a domain name. So with internet comes the internet service provider. And I guess majority of you know about internet service provider. And some of the most basic examples include Jio, Airtel, Vodafone, Idea, BSNL, and all. So if you're watching this session right now, you might be making use of an internet service provider to get to know all the information that I'm sharing. So an internet service provider is a company that provides you internet access to companies, families, and even mobile users. So these ISPs are basically internet service provider. They make use of fiber optics, satellites, copper wires, and all the other forms to provide internet access to all its customers. Access that you are seeking actually varies depending on what the customer requires. So ISPs provide the same service, except that they use different type of media to do so. So these ISPs actually bridge distant locations between cities, states, and countries. And because of these high-speed backbone systems, we are able to receive a mail within seconds, stream our favorite movie or web series without interruption, and play online games with no lag whatsoever. Internet actually works. So basically, since I gave you the example of internet service providers, so these ISPs are actually connected with one another directly or through other networks. And large corporations and telecommunication providers are also connected to these networks. The connections might use fiber optic cables, satellite links, or radio transmissions. And this vast web forms the infrastructure of the whole internet. So an application on your smartphone may be connected to the internet using a dedicated server with a fixed IP address. So in this case, the application will have the destination IP address built into its software. If you're using a web browser, you can enter this exact URL of the site you want, follow a link on a web page, or use a search engine to find a website. URL, which stands for Uniform Resource Locator, you want, your browser tries to find the IP address belonging to that URL. And this is where a domain name server or DNS comes in. Browser sends a query to its local DNS asking for the IP address of the URL in question. If the server knows the IP address, it replies with that address. If not, it sends the query onto a DNS server with a more global list of URLs. Eventually, your device will get back to the IP address matching that particular URL. So once it has the IP address it needs, your device encapsulates your data in an IP packet with the destination address of the server. The IP packet travels over the network to the first router. Each router can quickly send IP packets via the best links on a journey around the globe. Routers can also choose between multiple paths based on speed or bandwidth. On the way, the changing links encapsulate the IP packet in a variety of different frames. Finally, the IP packet arrives at a router connected to the same local area network as the destination server, and the IP packet will be delivered to that device. So in a nutshell, this is how internet actually works, and it follows various transmission protocols underneath, which we will not be covering in much depth now. Right now know the difference, as we right now know about the basic functionality of the internet, we exactly need to know about being a client and a server. And this is a fundamental thing that you actually need to know about so that you can actually see on how web applications actually work. And what is the basic difference between a front-end development and the back-end development, which automatically boils down to client-side development or the server-side development. Basic thing that we need to understand if we are jumping right away into the web development, because there's a lot of stuff to cover in a very short span of time. Discuss what is the difference between a client and server. So client is basically closer to the user. So let's say you are making use of the YouTube application to see this session. So you can just see that you are making use of YouTube, and there are various buttons on YouTube. There are various other video suggestions on YouTube that you might want to take a look at. So this is the basic client-side interface of the YouTube application. You can interact with it, you can see some of the data on it, and you can virtually enjoy yourself on this platform. And this client-side interface is basically much more closer to you than the server-side interface. So the basic example of the client-side interface I can give is regarding web browsers or email clients or smartphone application. There are a whole lot of buttons, and it is basically following the graphical user interface application. So you can directly interact with it. You can click on some buttons, you can see some videos, you can read some text, and this is how you will be interacting with the whole application. On the other hand, servers are applications that are running on a remote computer on which the client-side interface is completely dependent upon. So if you're seeing away this session on YouTube, you should be like, you can see the client-side interface, but you will not be able to see the server-side interface. So this server-side interface is located at some data center where all this data is being processed and presented to you. So the client is actually bridging the gap between a user and the server-side interface and presenting all that information that you need to see through a client-side interface. So this is the basic difference between a client and a server. So you can interact with the client-side interface on your device, while the server-side interface is sitting at some other remote computer, which is actually controlling the whole data flow in the system. Difference between client and the server-side interface, and depending upon what sort of programming you do, you can easily develop client-side interfaces using front-end development and the server-side interfaces using back-end development. So what comprises of a web application? So a web application can be divided into 3 separate layers. So the first layer is a front-end layer, and this is basically the client-side interface that you are interacting with. So using the front-end layer, we can design web pages, we can design web applications, and we can perform all that client-side programming. So if you have studied HTML, CSS, or JavaScript some other day, then you can make use of all of them to make some client-side interfaces to which your user can interact to. With the front-end programming, you can also develop responsive web pages, and you can also develop mobile application using some separate frameworks. In the backend layer, you perform all your server-side logic, developing an application that can actually count all the steps and give you some sort of reward for that. So you can collect all that information using a client-side interface, but at the server-side interface, you actually need some sort of a logic building so that you can store all that data, and you can give some sort of a notification or give some sort of a data to your client-side interface. So a backend layer can actually manage all your server-side logic, and it can manage your database design as well. So to store the data, you need some sort of a database, and with the backend, you can manage this database, and you can store all the data for the future purpose, and you can query your data in the future as well. So with the backend layer, you can also design application programming interfaces so that your client-side interface can basically communicate with the backend layer, and they can pass on some data and present some useful information to the user. And lastly, we have the database access layer. So database access layer basically manages the whole database access. You can query your data from the database, you can store some of the data for the future use, and you can also manage the user data and secure them. So security is one of the major issues that is being followed by majority of the companies. And this is basically done so that they can secure the whole setup, they can secure the user's data so that they can make use of it for the future purpose. So let's talk about introduction to front-end web development. So in this session, we will be covering up the basics of front-end web development in theoretical way, and we will not be going much into the back-end development part because it has got its all sort of complexities and all. So let's get started with the front-end web development. So what exactly means to be a front-end? So this is a very much intuitive question because being a front-end developer basically means that you are developing client-side interface to which the user is communicating, and it is basically seeing all the data on your website. So if I just go back to a few years back, so majority of the developers were making use of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to create the basic front end, while at the back end, they were making use of Java or PHP or Ruby on Rails and Python for developing the backend interfaces. So JavaScript was not much in use back then. But after the introduction of separate frameworks and libraries like React or jQuery or Node.js, so majority of the developers started making use of JavaScript for all sort of functionalities that they want to implement in their application. So this exactly divided the whole front-end dogma into two parts. So one of them is being a front-end designer, while the other is being a front-end developer. So a front-end designer basically creates the user interface and the user experience of your application. He or she basically like creates the client-side interface and how the user will be communicating with your whole website. So the front-end designer will be taking care of all that, and they have to brainstorm a lot on how the user can be given a pleasant user interface or a pleasant user experience, because majority of the companies are focusing a lot upon the user experience of your application. So front-end designers basically make use of separate applications and tools like HTML, CSS, or JavaScript. And they also make use of some front-end libraries so that they can create the basic client-side interface. Have got front-end developers. And these front-end developers basically create the JavaScript functionality for your application. So they will be creating all the logic of your client-side interface, and they will be integrating some plugins or some sort of libraries that you basically need to make use of so that you can integrate your backend APIs as well. Calling yourself a front-end developer, you exactly need to identify on what sort of thing you're falling under. Hello? So if you're identifying yourself as a front-end developer, you need to identify on which separate area are you falling under. So are you a front-end designer or are you a front-end developer? So because both of them are highly specialized fields, and you need to identify on which part you specifically falls in. So what is front-end development? So basically front-end development has been defined to be quite tricky because front-end development is quite a specialized field, and it is being used to bridge the difference between the visual designers and the backend developers. So visual designers are basically those people who are creating the basic user interface and the user experience mock designs, which will be basically implemented on your website. While on the other side, you have got backend developers who are creating the whole logic layer of your application and are querying the database for all that data. So as a front-end developer, you have to bridge the visual designers, basically the UI and the UX designers, to the backend developers. Front-end development is also quite tricky because of the changing paradigms in front-end development. So 10 years back, we didn't have any sort of a front-end library like jQuery. So jQuery was quite a big thing back then. But now we have got plenty of JavaScript libraries and frameworks. So some of them include Angular or Vue or React, and they are basically changing the whole front-end paradigm. So developers are increasingly sticking to these front-end libraries and frameworks so that they can create their basic web applications with them. And HTML and CSS are still in use, but front-end libraries, HTML and CSS are now being increasingly pushed to being existent. And lastly, front-end development has quite of an issue with the performance and the quality assurance. So testing a front-end application is quite tricky. So you need to use separate libraries and tools for testing your front-end application and to see if your front-end is basically performing up to your expectations or not. And lastly, you have got cross-browser compatibility, which simply means that you have to test your front-end application on a variety of devices. So you should be testing your front-end application on your Chrome browser, or you can test it on a Mozilla Firefox, or you can test it on even on an Internet Explorer. And you need to test for its responsiveness on various mobile browsers as well. And this is how you see whether your web application is following the cross-browser compatibility or not. So front-end development is increasingly tricky, and this is why many of the people they regard as front-end development to be somewhat harder than the back-end development. You'll be learning the front-end development. So the main reason why you should be learning front-end development is because it is one of the most profitable skill set in the market. So just like if you are going 10 years back, we didn't have much front-end development tools except HTML, CSS, Bootstrap, and jQuery. So majority of the front-end developers were making use of these separate tools and technologies for all their tasks. But now that we have got separate libraries and frameworks for all our thing, there are a variety of developer roles which are exactly employing for all these tools and technologies. So it is quite of a profitable skill set, and you can make use of these tools and technologies to create your front-end application in a very quick time. And with front-end development, you will have plenty of opportunities for freelancing and development as well. So many of the companies, they are looking for front-end developers which can create their basic front-end application. So there are a lot of opportunities there as well, which you can capitalize upon so that you can present a minimal viable product in the market. So with the rise in the frameworks and the libraries, the whole development workflow has been made easier, so you can capitalize upon, and you will get a lot of flexibility in development as well. So you don't need to just get stuck on HTML, CSS, or Bootstrap or some other technology, but you can other libraries on frameworks if you are finding it flexible and finding it useful for your current role. So this is exactly why you should be learning front-end development and why you should be exactly capitalizing upon that. Started with the basics. So if you already know the basic front-end development, then you might be acquainted with all these technologies, which is basically HTML5, CSS3, and JavaScript. So I will be just covering upon the basics of all these three so that you can get started with all of them. And I will also be covering upon few points on what exactly do you need to know for all these tools and technologies to get started with front-end development. Regarding HTML and CSS, so HTML is basically hypertext markup language, while CSS stands for cascading style sheets. So these two technologies are being used to create the basic front-end application without any sort of a functionality, which is provided by JavaScript instead. So if you already know HTML and CSS, then the basic things that you need to know about them is how you can create basic HTML structures and how you can add links, pictures, videos, and how you can make tables and layouts using the basic HTML thing. You can also make use of CSS selectors so that you can add some sort of a design to your website. So if you know web development, you might exactly know that HTML is just used to implement the whole web structure, while CSS, on the other hand, is being used to set up the whole design and how will the website be exactly like, how your user will be exactly seeing your website. So HTML and CSS are quite necessary for you to get started with the basic web designing and web implementation before you move ahead with the basic functionality that is being used with the JavaScript. Into the JavaScript, you also need to know how you can implement the user interface for your application. So for that part, you exactly need to understand on the user interaction with your website. So if you might go onto some popular website like Amazon.com or Netflix, then you might get to see that there is a very proper data flow that is going onto that whole website. You can see some product, you can click on it, you can see all the options that there are for the product, you can add it to your cart, you can go to your cart and you can click on the buy now option. So that's the whole data flow that is going on in the website. And this is exactly what you need to understand as a user interface or a user experience developer. So before you move ahead with the front-end development, you also need to have some idea about the design aspects as well. And this includes implementing some of the responsive web design components and prototyping or development with some sort of a tools like Adobe XD or Figma. So for Figma, you can basically mock your whole web application and how it will be looking to the user so that you can proceed further to the development and you can implement the basic workframe. So as a web developer, the basic advice that I want to give you is that if you are moving ahead with development with HTML and CSS, you also need to bridge the understanding between the visuals and the implementation with tools like Adobe XD or Figma so that any potential client might actually see on how your website will be actually looking to an end user. And finally, we have got the JavaScript Cosmos. So with JavaScript, you can basically implement all sort of functionality to your application. So if you are entering up into JavaScript, you can get started with some of the basics of JavaScript and understanding the syntax and how it works behind the scene. So if you have implemented some projects using HTML and CSS, you can just learn JavaScript so that you can give some sort of a functionality to those projects. And you can also make use of a JavaScript library like React or jQuery so that you can develop fast and you can rapidly integrate your application with some sort of a backend framework as well. Use of a framework like Angular so that you can develop your whole code as a separate architecture. So Angular actually implements model, view, and controller architecture, and you can basically model your whole web interface using that. So majority of people, they make a mistake that before JavaScript, they straight away jump into using some sort of a library or framework. So if they're making use of a library or framework like React or Angular respectively, they also need to understand some of the JavaScript basics. So basically jumping into a library or framework straight away will not be doing any justice to you. So it is always preferred for you to first learn the basics, understand how document object model and all the things work behind the scene before you straight away jump into some sort of library or framework so that you can rapidly prototype your development and you can also see on what the things are going on behind the scenes. And lastly, you should also be learning on some other aspects of development that includes deployment on the cloud. So you can learn on how you can make use of a Git as a version control system and GitHub so that you can collaborate on code with the other developers and how you can actually version control your whole application. So Git and GitHub is some essential tools that you need to know as a developer so that you can basically collaborate with the other developers and you can also open source projects as well. You should also know some of the deployment services like Heroku and Netlify so that you can rapidly deploy your application without needing to manage the whole infrastructure. So with Heroku, you can deploy full stack applications, while with Netlify, you can deploy only your front-end application that you can create by HTML, CSS, Bootstrap, or even by using React or Angular. Also learn on basic SSH, which basically stands for Secure Shell, and so that you can make use of file transfer protocols and all that. And lastly, having a knowledge about some cloud services like Amazon Web Services and Azure will allow you to deploy services quite rapidly without needing to manage the whole infrastructure. 7 to 8 years back, to set up a whole web application on a server, it was a very tedious procedure. But with the recent onset of cloud technologies like AWS or Azure, you can easily deploy your services without needing to manage the whole thing. That basically plays majority of the users, and this is that should they get started with the frameworks and libraries straight away. So if I'm talking about libraries like jQuery or React and frameworks like Angular and Vue, I think that majority of the developers are making use of these frameworks and libraries to basically make their whole web application, and they can also integrate the backend APIs as well. So should you get straight into frameworks or libraries, or should you just get started with the HTML, CSS, and the basic JavaScript? So this is one of the most pertinent questions that I will be covering in detail. So let me just take the example of a game you're developing. So let's say you are developing a game like PUBG that is running straight into your web browser. So you might be like developing some basic interface using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and you might be having some backend APIs that are working behind the scenes, and you deploy your application onto the web. So now you might see that some of your friends are playing your game, and they are inviting their own friends to play the same game. So you might see that quickly you have got 100 users, and these 100 users might grow into some 500 or 1,000 users. And now they're asking for more features into your game, and you are adding them using the HTML, CSS, and the JavaScript. You are seeing that your whole code is starting to swell up. So there is a lot amount of code, and it is quite difficult for you to manage all that. That you can hire a developer so that he or she can manage the whole application. So if you're hiring a developer, you might need to get them understand the whole web application and how the code is actually working. So this is exactly a very serious procedure, and with the multiple users working on an application in real time, you cannot manage the whole thing quickly. Instead of that, what you actually do is that you divide your whole application into an architecture-based setup. Are following some sort of an architecture like MVC, which stands for Model View Controller, or MVT, which basically stands for Model View Template, or MVVC or MVP. And this is basically dependent upon the user interface and the user experience you are catering to. The application in the same way, and this is where your framework or the library actually comes in. So with the aid of a framework or a library, you can minimize your code. So many of the developers, they follow a drive principle. So this basically means that don't repeat yourself. So you can basically follow this principle for your purpose, and you can make use of a framework or a library. So if you're creating just a hobby project and you are not exactly envisioning it to reach out to some hundreds or thousands of users, you should be sticking to only HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So once you are getting started with some framework or a library, you need to understand the user dynamics that is going behind the scene and how you're exactly catering to hundreds and thousands of users using that. Account some companies like Netflix or Microsoft, they are increasingly making use of libraries like React, while some other companies like Google, they are making use of Angular. So this is exactly what they are using so that they can cater to millions of users every day, and this is how exactly they are scaling up. So applications can either scale up vertically or horizontally, and with flexible front-end interfaces, which can be implemented by a library or framework, you can exactly scale to the backend demands as well. So with this, we have came to an end to this session. So you can find me on the following handles. So you can get in touch with me at Casper, or you can drop me a mail at the given mentioned mail ID. With this, we have been to the end of this session. So HoncHous is actually bringing out to you a development training workshop, web development training, which will basically be running on for 2 months, and you will be like getting hands-on with the projects and live training with all the web instructors at HoncHous. So you will be getting a live mentorship support. You can reach out to them for a one-on-one session, and you will also get a chance to work on 5 mini projects and 2 major projects. So with this, you will get started with the basic web development and how you can create a web application. So you can either stick to the front end or you can get started with the full stack web development easily. So the main advantage that we are providing you with this web development training is that you will be getting a live mentorship. And this is exactly what majority of the platforms don't provide you. You can ask your questions, you can resolve your doubts, and you can get started with some real hands-on project that might add value to your portfolio. We have finally came to the end of this session. If you have any question regarding front-end development, or if you have any other question about web development, so you can straight away ask that in the live chat, and I will be basically resolving that. So thank you.